I am Dominique Vance, 32 years old, and I have spent my entire life protecting my twin sister from the world. But when she collapsed on my doorstep, covered in blood and bruises, I realized I had failed. Her husband, a wealthy hedge fund manager, thought he had broken his submissive wife. He had no idea that for the next 2 weeks, he would be sleeping next to me instead. I swapped places with her, and I did not just survive his abuse. I dismantled his entire life, dollar by dollar, secret by secret. Before I tell you how I sent him to prison and took everything he owned, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that blood is thicker than water, and revenge is a dish best served cold. The heavy oak door of my Manhattan penthouse is designed to keep the world out. At 2 in the morning, the silence in my living room usually costs $5,000 a square foot. I was wide awake, staring at the financial reports glowing on my laptop screen, sipping a glass of Merlot that cost more than most people's car payments. Being a forensic accountant means I find the ugly truths people try to hide in their numbers. I am used to ugly truths. But nothing could have prepared me for the sound that shattered the silence. It was not a knock. It was the desperate rhythmic thud of a body throwing itself against the wood. I checked the security monitor. My heart stopped, then hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I disengaged the locks and pulled the heavy door open. Monique fell into the foyer, collapsing onto the cold, white marble floor. My twin sister. The mirror image of my face, but twisted into a mask of agony. I did not scream. I did not gasp. In my line of work, emotion is a liability. I stood there, frozen in my black silk robe, looking down at the woman who shared my DNA. She was wearing a trench coat over a torn nightgown. One of her eyes was swollen shut, a grotesque shade of purple and black, that made my own eye throb in sympathy. Her lip was split blood, drying in a dark crust at the corner of her mouth. She smelled like rain fear and expensive cologne. His cologne. I knelt beside her, my movements precise and mechanical. I touched her shoulder and she flinched, curling into a fetal position, protecting her ribs. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. This was not a mugging. This was not a car accident. This was domestic. Dominique. She whispered, her voice cracking through the blood in her throat. I am so sorry. I didn't know where else to go. He said he would kill me if I called the police. He said he would take the house and leave Mom and Dad on the street. I looked at the blood staining my pristine white floor. It was a stark, violent contrast to the sterile perfection of my life. Monique was the soft one, the one who taught piano, the one who wanted to be a mother, the one who married Preston Sterling, the golden boy of New York finance. I was the hard one, the shark, the one who stayed single because I refused to let anyone control me. Get up, I said. My voice was dangerously low, lacking the warmth she probably expected. I was not offering comfort. I was assessing the damage. I helped her stand, feeling the tremors running through her thin frame. She was so light. Too light. He had been starving her too. I guided her to the velvet sofa, the city lights of New York glittering indifferently behind us, through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I poured her a glass of water, my hands steady, my mind racing at 100 miles an hour. As I looked at her broken face, the sadness in my chest evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning rage. Preston Sterling had broken my sister. He thought he had crushed the spirit of the woman he married. But he forgot one thing. There were two of us, and he was about to meet the other one. I handed her the glass of water and watched as she tried to lift it. Her hands were trembling so violently that half the water sloshed onto her lap before the glass even touched her lips. I reached out and steadied her hands with mine. My skin felt burning hot against hers. Tell me, I said, my voice steady and commanding. Tell me exactly what happened tonight. Do not leave anything out. Monique took a ragged breath, wincing as her chest expanded. It was the steak, she whispered, staring at the floor as if the memory was burning a hole in the carpet. I burned the steak, Dom. Just a little bit on the edge. You know he likes it medium rare. He came home early from the firm, saw the char on the meat. and he just snapped. He threw the plate against the wall. The porcelain shattered right next to my head, and then he grabbed me by the hair. I felt a muscle in my jaw jump. Over a steak. He had beaten my sister, a woman who had never raised her voice in her life, because of a piece of meat. "Why didn't you leave him before Monique?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. "Why didn't you call me the first time he put his hands on you?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her swollen face. "I couldn't," she sobbed. "He told me that if I ever tried to leave, or if I ever called the police, he would destroy Mom and Dad. He bought the mortgage on their house last year, Dom. He said he would foreclose on them immediately. He said he would make sure they spent their retirement in a homeless shelter. He said he has lawyers who can bury us in so much paperwork we would never see daylight again." I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Preston Sterling. He wasn't just a brute, he was a strategist. He had weaponized our parents' financial security to keep my sister as his personal punching bag. He knew Monique would endure anything to protect family. He counted on her silence, but he hadn't counted on mine. "Let me see," I said, turning back to her. "I need to see the damage." I carefully peeled back the torn silk of her nightgown. I hissed in a breath. Her left side was a canvas of violence. Deep purple and black bruises bloomed across her ribs, looking like storm clouds under her skin. I pressed my fingers gently against her side and she screamed a sharp, guttural sound that tore through the room. 2 cracked ribs. I said, my forensic brain automatically assessing the injury. "Maybe 3. You need a hospital, but we cannot go there. He will have people watching the emergency rooms. He expects you to go running for help so he can drag you back." Monique grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please don't make me go back," she begged. "I would rather die than go back to that house." "You are not going back," I said. And for the first time that night I smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile I wore when I found $1 million discrepancy in a CEO's tax return. "You are going to stay here. You are going to sleep in my bed, eat my food, and heal. You are going to disappear for a while." "But he will come for me," she panicked. "He will come here." "No, he won't," I replied, walking over to my closet. I pulled out a pair of scissors and a bottle of makeup remover. "He won't come looking for you because he thinks you are still there. Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Preston Sterling is going to wake up in his house, make his coffee, and look him in the eye. But it won't be you." I sat down in front of the mirror and looked at my own face. It was time to become the version of Monique that Preston Sterling should have feared all along. "You think he knows you?" I asked, my voice cutting through her panic like a scalpel. Monique nodded, her hands clutching the velvet cushion of my sofa. "He knows everything about me, Dom. He will know it is not me the second I walk through that door." I shook my head slowly, pacing the length of the room. "You are giving him too much credit. Preston Sterling does not love you, Monique. He does not even like you. To men like him, you are not a complex human being with thoughts and feelings. You are an asset. You are a piece of furniture that talks. Does a man look deep into the soul of his toaster? No. He just expects it to work when he presses the button. As long as I cook his dinner, look at the floor, and tremble when he raises his voice, he will not see me. He only sees what he wants to see, which is a submissive wife who belongs to him." I stopped pacing and held out my hand. "Give me your phone. Now." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, conditioned by fear to keep that lifeline open, but then she placed the device in my palm. I immediately dropped it into a Faraday bag, a signal-blocking pouch I used for sensitive client meetings. From this moment on, Monique Sterling is offline. No texts to Mom, no calls to friends. You are a ghost. You stay in this apartment, you order delivery using my cash account, and you do not open the door for anyone. Then I turned to the vanity mirror. The physical transformation had to be absolute. My hair was sharp, angular, styled for intimidation in a boardroom. Hers was soft layered, the kind of hair that looked good in a country club brochure. I did not hesitate. I pulled a pair of professional shears from my drawer, grabbed a handful of my own expensive keratin-treated hair, and let the blades crunch through the strands. Dark locks fell to the marble floor. I trimmed and textured until my silhouette matched hers perfectly. Next came the face. I grabbed a bottle of astringent and scrubbed away my signature red lipstick and my sharp winged eyeliner. I needed to look pale. I needed to look exhausted. I used a contour palette not to enhance my beauty, but to hollow out my cheeks, mimicking the weight loss stress had forced upon her. I studied her posture. She hunched her shoulders forward, protecting her heart. I let my own posture slump, hiding my confidence under a layer of feigned defeat. Finally, I opened my safe and took out a delicate gold pendant. It looked like a standard anniversary gift, but I had modified it myself 2 years ago for a corporate espionage case. Inside the pendant was a high-fidelity listening device with a 72-hour battery life and cloud sync capabilities. I fastened it around my neck. This was my insurance. Every threat, every insult, every admission of financial fraud he made would be recorded. I stood up and turned to face my sister. She gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "It is like looking in a mirror," she whispered. "No," I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave to match her soft cadence. "It is better than a mirror, because the woman you see standing here is not afraid to burn his house down. I am going into the lion's den, Monique, and I am wearing his destruction around my neck." The drive to Westport felt like traveling to another planet. I left behind the vibrant chaos of the city and entered the manicured silence of Connecticut wealth. I was driving Monique's car, a 5-year-old sedan that rattled every time I hit 40 miles per hour. It was another one of Preston's subtle controls. He drove a Porsche. His wife drove a car that teenagers would be embarrassed to be seen in. As I pulled into the long, winding driveway of the Sterling estate, I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. It wasn't fear, it was disgust. The house was magnificent, a sprawling colonial revival that looked like it belonged on a postcard. White pillars, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a lawn so green it looked artificial. But to me it looked like a prison. A golden cage where my sister had slowly been suffocated. I parked the car and took a moment to check my reflection in the rearview mirror. The makeup was perfect. The bruise I had skillfully applied to my cheekbone looked angry and painful. My posture was slumped, my eyes downcast. I was ready. I was Monique. I walked up the stone steps and unlocked the front door. The air inside was cool and smelled of lemon polish and old money. Silence hung heavy in the hallway, the kind of silence that demands you tiptoe. I didn't. I let the door close with a heavy thud. Preston was in the living room, sitting in his favorite leather armchair, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. The room was dimly lit, shadows dancing on the expensive oil paintings. He didn't turn around. He didn't even stiffen. The arrogance of the man was palpable from 20 feet away. "You finally decided to come crawling back," he said. His voice was smooth-cultured and utterly devoid of warmth. "I thought you might have run home to your parents. I was just about to call your father and tell him you were having another one of your hysterical episodes." I walked into the room, keeping my steps hesitant. I stood behind the sofa, clutching my purse like a shield. "I didn't go to my parents," I said, making my voice tremble just enough. "I just drove around. I needed to think." "Think!" Preston laughed, a short, sharp sound. He took a sip of his drink and finally swiveled the chair around to face me. He looked me up and down, his eyes cold and critical. "Since when do you think, Monique? You react. You cry. You make messes. Like that steak. Like this situation. Look at you. You look like a wreck." I felt the anger coil in my stomach like a viper, but I kept my face blank. I looked at the man who had beaten my sister just 24 hours ago. He was handsome in a generic way, blonde hair, jawline sharp enough to cut glass, wearing a suit that cost more than my sister's car. but all I saw was a bully, a weak, insecure little man who needed to hurt women to feel powerful. "I'm sorry about the steak," I whispered, forcing the words out. Preston stood up and walked toward me. He moved with the confidence of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to run. He stopped inches from my face. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He reached out and touched the fake bruise on my cheek. His fingers were cold. "You should be sorry," he said softly. "I do everything for you. I give you this house, this life, and all I ask for is a little competence, a little gratitude." "Is that so hard?" I didn't flinch. I let him touch me, recording every second of it on the device hidden beneath my shirt. "No, Preston," I said, lifting my eyes to meet his for a brief, dangerous second. "It isn't hard at all." "Good," he said, turning his back on me to refill his drink. "Go upstairs and clean yourself up. You smell like cheap takeout. And Monique, don't ever walk out that door without my permission again." I watched him pour another drink, his back vulnerable, his guard completely down. He thought he had won. He thought the mouse had returned to the trap. He had no idea he had just locked himself in with the cat. I turned and walked toward the stairs, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The game had officially begun. I stopped with my foot on the first step of the grand staircase. His voice stopped me, not because I was afraid, but because the command was so casually demeaning. "Wait," Preston said, not even looking away from his empty glass. "Before you go, scrub that stench off yourself, pour me a glass of ice water. And make sure the ice is crushed, not cubed. You know how I hate the sound of cubes clinking against the crystal." I turned around slowly. This was the dynamic. He barked, she ran. He snapped his fingers, she jumped. For 10 years, Monique had been running back and forth to the kitchen like an unpaid servant in her own home. But tonight, the servant was on strike. I walked back into the living room, but I did not head for the kitchen. I walked straight past him toward the climate-controlled wine cabinet built into the mahogany wall. I could feel his eyes on my back, confused, irritated. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tightening. I said, "Water, Monique." "Are you deaf as well as stupid?" I ignored him. I opened the glass door and scanned the rows of bottles. Preston prided himself on his collection. He bought wine not to drink but to possess, to brag about. My eyes landed on the crown jewel of his hoard, a 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild. He had paid $5,000 for it at auction last year. He had told Monique that if she ever even breathed on it, he would break her fingers. I reached in and grabbed the dusty bottle by the neck. "Put that down," Preston said, standing up. His voice was low, dangerous. "That is not for you. That bottle is worth more than your life." I turned to face him, the heavy bottle cool in my hand. I didn't use a corkscrew. I didn't look for a decanter. I swung my arm in a violent arc and smashed the neck of the bottle against the edge of his antique marble coffee table. The sound was like a gunshot. Glass shattered. Dark red wine exploded outward, spraying across the white silk rug and splattering onto Preston's Italian leather shoes. He froze, his mouth hanging open, his face draining of color. He looked from the jagged remains of the bottleneck to the wine bleeding into his carpet. "You are crazy," he whispered, genuine shock replacing his arrogance. "You have lost your mind." I didn't blink. I raised the jagged bottle to my lips, ignoring the sharp edges of the glass, and took a long, deep swallow. The wine was exquisite, complex tasting of history and money. I let a rivulet of red escape the corner of my mouth and run down my chin, mimicking the blood he had drawn from my sister's face the night before. I lowered the bottle and stared straight into his stunned eyes. My voice was calm, terrifyingly steady. "It is a bold vintage," I said, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. "Full-bodied, a little arrogant, just like you." Preston took a step back as if I had just pulled a knife. He had never seen this woman before. He had never seen Monique destroy something he loved. I set the broken bottle down on the ruined table, the glass grinding against the marble. "It is a shame," I continued, stepping closer to him until I could smell the fear radiating off him. This wine is excellent. It is just too bad that the person drinking it is nothing but a worthless piece of furniture. Isn't that what you called me? I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in a puddle of $5,000 wine, too shocked to even scream. Up the stairs I went, and this time he didn't dare tell me to stop. The reign of terror had just changed hands. The morning sun flooded the kitchen of the Sterling estate, illuminating the excessive luxury that my sister had been trapped in. Usually by 7 in the morning, Monique would have been awake for 2 hours. She would have already squeezed fresh orange juice, brewed the specific Colombian roast Preston demanded, and prepared a full English breakfast. She would be standing by the stove, anxious and exhausted, hoping the eggs were not too runny or the toast too brown. But today the stove was cold. The counters were bare. And I was sitting at the massive granite island, wearing a pair of black silk pajamas I had found in the back of her closet, calmly eating a bowl of granola. I heard Preston before I saw him. His footsteps on the hardwood floor were heavy and impatient. He marched into the kitchen, adjusting his silk tie, already radiating that unique mix of arrogance and irritability that defined him. He stopped dead in the doorway when he saw the empty table. He looked at the stove, then at the coffee machine, which was dark and silent, and finally at me. "Where is my coffee?" he asked. His voice was not loud yet, but it had a dangerous edge. "And where are my eggs? You know I have a meeting with the partners at 9. I chewed my granola, slowly swallowing before I even acknowledged his presence. I did not look up from my bowl. "The coffee beans are in the pantry, Preston. The eggs are in the fridge. The pans are in the drawer to your left. I am sure a man of your immense talents can figure out how to put them all together." Preston walked over to the island, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand down on the granite, making my spoon rattle in the bowl. "Stop playing games, Monique. Get up and make my breakfast. You have one job in this house. Do it." I finally looked up. I let my eyes travel over his expensive suit, his manicured hands, and his furious face. Then I held up my right hand, flexing the fingers stiffly. "I cannot cook today," I said, my voice flat and devoid of apology. "My hand is throbbing. It is very painful. I wonder why that is. Maybe it has something to do with the way someone twisted it behind my back yesterday. Or maybe it is from shielding my face from a husband who thinks domestic violence is a recreational sport. So if you want to eat, you will have to make it yourself." Preston stared at me, his eyes widening in disbelief. He was not used to resistance. He was used to tears. He was used to begging. The sheer audacity of my refusal short-circuited his temper. Without thinking, his instinct took over. He raised his hand, his palm open, ready to deliver the backhanded slap that had kept my sister in line for years. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to cower. Instead, I moved. In one fluid motion, I snatched the heavy silver butter knife from the counter. It was not a sharp blade, but the way I held it, pointed directly at his jugular, made it clear it was a weapon. I did not stand up. I stayed seated, my eyes locked on his, the tip of the knife hovering inches from his expensive silk tie. "Do it," I whispered. "Go ahead, Preston. Swing that hand. But I promise you, if you touch me, this knife is going into your neck. And I will not stop there. I will carve my resignation letter into your chest." Preston froze. His hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly. He looked at the knife, then at my eyes. He saw something there that terrified him. He saw a predator. For the first time in his miserable life, he realized that the woman in his kitchen was not prey. "Put the knife down," he stammered, his voice losing its booming authority. "You are hysterical. You need help." I lowered the knife slowly, but I did not put it down. I set it on the placemat next to my bowl within easy reach. "I am not the one who needs help, Preston. Now get out of my kitchen. You are ruining my appetite." He stood there for a second longer, breathing hard, his ego bruised more than his body ever could be. Then he turned and stormed out, grabbing his briefcase and slamming the front door so hard the windows rattled. I picked up my spoon and took another bite of granola. It tasted like victory. The silence in the house did not last long. Barely an hour after Preston had stormed out, the front door opened again. It was not him. It was the only person Preston feared more than public humiliation. His mother, Victoria Sterling. She did not ring the doorbell. She did not knock. She simply used her own key, walking into the foyer with the entitlement of a woman who believes the world exists solely to serve her. I was still in the kitchen scrolling through financial news on my tablet when I heard the click of her heels on the marble. It was a distinctive sound, sharp and rhythmic like a countdown timer. Victoria appeared in the doorway dressed in a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than my sister's college tuition. Her silver hair was coiffed into a helmet of perfection, and her eyes cold and blue, like her son's, scanned the room for flaws. They landed on me. "Monique," she said, her voice dripping with a mixture of disappointment and disdain. "It is 10 o'clock in the morning. Why are you still in your sleepwear? And why is there a bowl of unwashed cereal on the counter?" I didn't stand up to greet her. I didn't rush to offer her tea. I simply turned my head and looked at her. "Hello, Victoria. I am taking a personal day." "A personal day," she repeated, stepping into the kitchen. She avoided the spot on the floor where Preston had stood earlier, as if she could sense the lingering tension. "Being a wife is not a job you take days off from, my dear. It is a duty, a vocation. But I suppose I should not be surprised." I warned Preston that this would happen. She walked over to the counter and ran a gloved finger along the granite, checking for dust. Finding none, she looked disappointed. She turned her gaze back to me, her expression hardening. "I always told him that breeding matters," she said, her tone conversational, as if she were discussing the weather and not insulting my entire heritage. "You can dress a person up, put them in a nice house, and give them a generous allowance. But eventually their true nature comes out. Laziness is in your blood, isn't it? It is that inherent desire to do the bare minimum and expect a handout." My blood ran cold. This was the woman my sister had tried so hard to please. Monique had baked cakes for this woman, bought her thoughtful gifts, and endured her passive-aggressive insults for a decade. And all Victoria saw was a stereotype. I swiveled the bar stool around to face her fully. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "What did you just say?" Victoria blinked, feigning innocence. "I am just speaking the truth, Monique. Look at you, sitting around while my son is out working hard to maintain this lifestyle. You are becoming complacent. You are becoming heavy. Have you gained weight? Your face looks puffy." She was talking about the swelling from her son's fist. She had to know. She had raised him. She knew exactly what kind of monster she had created because she was the one who had molded him. I stood up slowly. "I am not heavy, Victoria, and I am not lazy. I am recovering. Recovering from what she scoffed. A difficult day of shopping. Recovering from the realization that I married into a family that mistakes cruelty for class," I said, taking a step toward her. "And as for my nature, you should be careful. You might find that my nature is a lot less forgiving than you think." Victoria took a step back, clutching her pearls instinctively. She looked at me with a flicker of unease. There was something different about the mouse today, and even the cat was starting to get nervous. But she wasn't done yet. She had come here to assert dominance, and she wasn't leaving until she had drawn blood. Victoria was just getting started. She paced around the kitchen island, her heels clicking like a metronome, listing off my sister's failures, as if she were reading from a prepared script. She talked about the dust on the mantelpiece, the lack of fresh flowers in the foyer, and the fact that Preston's shirts were not being starched to his exact specifications. She placed her handbag on the counter next to me to emphasize a point. It was a Himalayan Birkin made of white crocodile skin with diamond-encrusted hardware. It was worth more than most people earned in 5 years, and she had left it wide open. I listened to her drone on my eyes fixed on that bag. It was the ultimate symbol of the Sterling family values. Expensive, cold, and made from the skin of a predator. I looked down at my bowl of oatmeal. It was thick, sticky, and steaming hot, swirled with dark maple syrup. "I am listening, Victoria." I said softly, reaching for the bowl. You are right. I have been clumsy lately. I have been off balance. I lifted the heavy ceramic bowl with my left hand, the hand that Preston had twisted behind my back the night before. I let my fingers tremble visibly. I watched Victoria's eyes track the movement, but she was too busy pontificating to realize the trajectory. I took a step toward the sink, but as I passed the handbag, I let my knees buckle slightly. I let out a sharp, convincing gasp of pain. My hand jerked supposedly a spasm from the injury, and the bowl tipped forward. It happened in slow motion. The entire contents of the bowl, the hot oats, the sticky syrup, the milk slid right off the spoon and cascaded directly into the open mouth of the Birkin. Victoria screamed. It was a high-pitched, horrified shriek that shattered her composed facade. She lunged for the bag, but it was too late. The hot sludge was already seeping into the pristine white leather lining coating her wallet, her phone, and her silk scarf in a brown, sticky mess. "Oh my God!" she shrieked, clutching the ruined bag to her chest, heedless of the oatmeal getting on her Chanel suit. "You idiot! You clumsy, stupid idiot! Do you have any idea what you have done? This is a limited edition." I stood there clutching my wrist, forcing tears into my eyes. "Oh, Victoria, I am so sorry," I cried, my voice trembling with fake devastation. "It is my arm. It gave out. The nerve damage from last night. When Preston slammed me against the wall, my hands just do not work right today." Victoria froze. She looked from the ruined bag to my face. I had trapped her. If she continued to scream about the bag, she would be admitting that a piece of leather was more important than her daughter-in-law's physical safety. If she acknowledged the injury, she would have to admit her son was an abuser. She turned purple with suppressed rage. She opened her mouth to yell, then closed it. She glared at the oatmeal dripping onto the floor. "Clean this up," she hissed, her voice shaking. "I cannot," I whispered, backing away and holding my wrist. "It hurts too much. I think I need to go lie down. You know where the paper towels are." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the matriarch of the Sterling family standing in a puddle of syrup, forced to clean up her own mess for the first time in her life. As I climbed the stairs, I allowed myself a genuine smile. One Sterling down, one to go. Victoria fled the house 10 minutes later, clutching her ruined bag like a wounded puppy. The silence returned, but it was broken almost immediately by the vibration of Monique's phone on the kitchen counter. It was a notification from the bank. The primary credit card, the one Monique used for groceries and gas, had been suspended. Then another notification. The emergency card, suspended. Then the joint checking account, access denied. I looked at the screen and smirked. Preston moved fast. He was not home yet, but he had obviously received a hysterical phone call from his mother. This was his favorite punishment, financial strangulation. He knew that without money, Monique was trapped. She could not run, she could not hire a lawyer, she could not even buy food without his permission. He wanted me to crawl to him, to beg for forgiveness, so he could feel like a god again. But Preston had made a critical error. He forgot who he was dealing with. He thought he was punishing a housewife. He did not know he was declaring cyber warfare on a forensic accountant. I picked up the phone and walked calmly into his home office. It was a dark, oak-paneled room that smelled of cigars and self-importance. I sat down at his massive desktop computer. I did not need to guess his password. Men like Preston are predictable. They use variations of their own names, their birth years, or the word winner. It took me 3 tries to get in. I bypassed his personal banking. That was amateur hour. I went straight for the corporate accounts. As a forensic auditor, I know exactly how hedge fund managers structure their assets to avoid taxes. I navigated through the labyrinth of his shell companies. I found a subsidiary registered in the Cayman Islands called Sterling Ventures. It was a slush fund he used for consulting fees, which was just code for bribes and personal indulgences. I did not just reactivate Monique's old cards. That would be too obvious. Instead, I accessed the payroll system for Sterling Ventures. I created a new profile for a freelance consultant named M. Vance. I assigned this consultant a corporate black card with a $50,000 monthly limit filed under miscellaneous business expenses. I typed fast, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I approved the card issuance with his digital signature, which he had foolishly saved on the desktop. Within 5 minutes, I had the digital card details loaded into the mobile wallet on Monique's phone. I leaned back in his leather chair and spun around. He had tried to cut off my supply line, and in doing so, he had forced me to open the vault. I picked up the phone and ordered a $500 sushi lunch from the most expensive place in town. The transaction went through instantly. I deleted the browser history, wiped the cache, and stood up. Preston wanted to play games with money. He wanted to see if I could survive without his allowance. He was about to find out that I did not need his allowance. I had his capital. And I was going to spend it on a wardrobe that would make his mother look like a pauper. With the digital black card secured in my mobile wallet, I drove Monique's rattletrap sedan straight to the most expensive district in town. It was time to shed the skin of the victim. Monique's closet was a tragedy of beige cardigans, shapeless floral dresses, and sensible flats. It was the wardrobe of a woman trying to disappear, a woman trying not to take up space. I was going to burn it all. I marched into the most exclusive boutique in Westport, the kind of place where they serve champagne before they even show you a price tag. The sales associate, a woman named Chloe, who had likely sold Monique endless pastel disappointments over the years, looked at me with confusion. She saw the bruise on my cheek, but she also saw the fire in my eyes. "Mrs. Sterling," she stammered, smoothing her skirt. "We have some lovely new modest prints in the back. I think there is a nice lavender shift dress that your husband would approve of." I looked at the rack of clothes she was gesturing toward. They were soft. They were apologetic. They were weak. I looked her dead in the eye. "Burn them," I said, my voice cutting through the soft jazz music playing in the store. "I am done with florals, Chloe. I am done with beige. I am done with asking for approval. Today I want armor." I spent the next 2 hours turning that dressing room into a war room. I stripped off Monique's cotton blends and replaced them with Italian wool and French silk. I selected tailored blazers with sharp shoulders that made me look wider, stronger. I chose pencil skirts that allowed for movement but commanded respect. I bought 5-inch stilettos that clicked against the marble floor like gunshots. I chose colors that screamed for attention: blood red, midnight blue, jet black. When I stepped out of the fitting room wearing a $3,000 suit, I didn't see a battered housewife in the mirror anymore. I saw a CEO. I saw a predator. I saw myself. The pile of clothes on the counter was obscene, $15,000 worth of high fashion. Chloe's hands shook as she folded the items into crisp white bags. She looked at the total on the screen and swallowed hard. "Shall I put this on your personal account, Mrs. Sterling?" she asked nervously. "You know Mr. Sterling usually gets an alert for purchases over $500. He might be concerned." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that didn't reach my eyes. I pulled out my phone and tapped it against the payment terminal. The machine beeped instantly. "Transaction approved." "Not today, Chloe," I said. "This is a corporate expense. Mr. Sterling is investing in a complete rebranding strategy. And one more thing." I pointed to the receipt printer as it churned out the long slip of paper. "Do not email that to the house. Courier the physical receipt directly to his office in the city. Mark it urgent. And write a note on the back for me. Just write 3 words. Cost of business." I walked out of the store swinging the heavy shopping bags, feeling lighter than I had in years. I could almost hear the sound of Preston's blood pressure spiking when that receipt landed on his mahogany desk in the middle of a client meeting. He wanted a trophy wife. He was about to find out that some trophies are too expensive to keep. I did not go home after shopping. I had one more stop to make. It was Tuesday, which meant the ladies of the Westport Country Club were gathered on the terrace for their weekly gossip session. These women were the gatekeepers of local society. They had spent years making Monique feel small, mocking her clothes, her background, and her inability to control her husband. They were about to meet the new management. I walked onto the terrace. The conversation stopped instantly. My blood-red blazer was a violent splash of color against the sea of pastel sundresses. I saw them exchange looks. Candace, the ringleader, a woman whose smile was as sharp as a scalpel, waved me over. Her eyes lingered on my bruise, and then on my suit. Her expression caught between pity and amusement. Monique, she cooed, her voice loud enough for the next table to hear. You look so different. Is that a suit? It is very aggressive. Did Preston finally let you out of the house or did you escape? The other women tittered, sipping their mimosas. They expected me to blush, to stammer, to make an excuse and scurry away. Instead, I pulled out a chair and sat down at the head of the table. I signaled the waiter and ordered a double Scotch neat. I looked at Candace. I am not escaping anything, Candace. But speaking of escapes, how is your husband Arthur? I heard the IRS audit is not going well. It must be stressful knowing that the government is looking into those offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Candace froze, her glass halfway to her mouth. Her face went pale. How do you know about that? She whispered. I did not answer her. I turned to Beatrice, a woman who had once asked Monique if she was the help at her own wedding. And Beatrice? I continued, my voice smooth and conversational. I love your diamond earrings. They are stunning. It is amazing what your husband can afford, even with the child support payments he is secretly sending to that woman in Jersey City. Does she know about you yet? Or does he keep his two families completely separate? Beatrice dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her china plate. The table went dead silent. The air was thick with panic. These women lived in glass houses and I was holding a bag of rocks. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, looking at each of them in turn. I know everything, I said softly. I know who is sleeping with the tennis coach. I know who is popping Xanax to get through the day. And I know exactly how much debt every single family at this table is hiding. So the next time you want to make a joke about me or my marriage or my bruise, just remember one thing. I have the receipts. I took a sip of the scotch the waiter had just placed in front of me. It burned pleasantly. Enjoy your lunch, ladies, I said. I stood up, smoothed my lapels, and walked away. I did not look back, but I could feel their terrified eyes on me. I had not just silenced the gossip. I had taken a hostage. The social hierarchy of Westport had just been rearranged, and for the first time, a sterling wife was at the top of the food chain. Preston left for the city at 6 in the morning, eager to go bully his subordinates and pretend he was the king of Wall Street. The moment the iron gates of the estate clicked shut behind his silver Porsche, the house became my playground. I did not waste time. I went straight to the one room in the house that was strictly off-limits to Monique. His study. The heavy oak doors swung open with a groan. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, aged leather, and aggressive masculinity. This was his sanctuary. To Monique, this room was a place of fear where she was summoned to be lectured on her budget or her behavior. To me, it was a crime scene waiting to be processed. I walked to the massive mahogany desk and sat in his chair. It was positioned to look down on anyone who entered the room. I spun it around and began opening drawers. Most people hide their secrets in safes behind paintings. Arrogant men like Preston hide their secrets in plain sight, believing their wives are too stupid to understand what they are looking at. He kept his personal ledgers in the bottom drawer, right underneath a stack of Golf Digest magazines. I pulled the heavy binders onto the desk and opened them. To an untrained eye, the rows of numbers and acronyms would look like boring quarterly reports. But I am not an untrained eye. I am a forensic accountant. I read spreadsheets the way other people read novels. And this novel was a tragedy of greed. I ran my finger down the columns of the current fiscal year. At first glance, everything seemed balanced, but then I saw it. A recurring payment to an entity listed as Blue Horizon Consulting. The amounts were irregular: $12,000 one month, $45,000 the next, all coded as market research or logistical support. I pulled out my phone and did a quick database search on the entity. Blue Horizon Consulting was not a research firm. It was a shell company registered in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. It had no employees, no website, and no physical office. It was a ghost. I laughed out loud in the quiet room. It was a cold, sharp sound. Preston was not just abusive. He was a thief. He was skimming money from his own hedge funds investors, siphoning off capital under the guise of business expenses and funneling it into a tax-free offshore account. This was not just a marital dispute anymore. This was federal wire fraud. This was tax evasion. This was the kind of white-collar felony that puts men like him in federal prison for 15 years. I pulled out my phone and switched to the camera. I began photographing every page, every bank transfer number, every incriminating signature. Click. 10 years in prison. Click. Asset forfeiture. Click. The complete destruction of the sterling reputation. He thought he was hiding his wealth from his wife to keep her dependent on him. He thought he was being clever. Instead, he had just handed his executioner the axe. I finished photographing the last page, closed the binder, and slid it back under the golf magazines. I aligned the edges perfectly, ensuring nothing looked disturbed. I stood up and smoothed my blazer. I had walked into this room looking for leverage. I was walking out with a death warrant. Preston walked through the front door just past 8 o'clock that evening. He brought the smell of the city with him, a mix of exhaust fumes, expensive scotch, and the faint cloying scent of another woman's perfume. He tossed his briefcase onto the antique entryway table, not caring if the metal clasps scratched the wood. In his mind, he was the king returning to his castle, and he expected his queen to be waiting in the kitchen, keeping his dinner warm and his ego polished. He did not find me in the kitchen. I was sitting in the living room, occupying his favorite leather wingback chair. My legs were crossed, clad in the sharp black trousers I had purchased that afternoon. In one hand, I held a crystal tumbler of his best single malt whiskey. In the other, I held a thick leather-bound copy of Security Analysis by Benjamin Graham. It is a dense, complex text, considered the Bible of value investing, and it is definitely not on the reading list of the Westport Housewives Book Club. Preston stopped in the doorway, loosening his tie. He blinked, looking at the book, then at my face. A smirk curled the corner of his lip, condescending and cruel. "What on earth are you doing, Monique?" he asked, walking toward the bar cart. "Did you run out of fashion magazines? Or are you just looking for pictures of old men to see what successful people look like? Do not hurt your pretty little head trying to read the big words." I did not close the book. I turned a page slowly, the sound of the paper crisp and loud in the quiet room. "I am just trying to take an interest in your work, Preston," I said, my voice cool and even. "You always complain that I am too simple to understand the complexities of your genius, so I decided to educate myself." Preston laughed, pouring himself a drink. "That is adorable. But finance is a man's game, sweetheart. It is about instinct, aggression, math. You just worry about spending the money. Leave the making of it to the big boys." I snapped the book shut with a heavy thud. The sound echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. "Actually, I do have a question," I said, fixing him with a stare that pinned him to the spot. "I was reading about the impact of federal policy on high-yield debt portfolios." "Tell me, Preston. With the Federal Reserve signaling a hike in marginal interest rates next quarter, how are you hedging the exposure on your leveraged positions? If the yield curve inverts, are you still maintaining a 4-to-1 leverage ratio on those offshore assets? Or have you moved into treasury bonds to mitigate the liquidity risk?" The room went dead silent. Preston froze his glass halfway to his mouth. The ice cubes clinked once and then settled. He turned around slowly. His eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. He looked at me as if I had suddenly started speaking fluent Russian. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated confusion. "Who told you that?" he whispered, his voice losing all its power. "Where did you hear those terms? Who have you been talking to?" I stood up and walked over to him, stopping just inches away so I could look down at him in his shock. I smiled, and it was the sharpest thing in the room. "It is just basic arithmetic, darling. Even a simple housewife can understand that if you borrow too much money when rates are rising, the house of cards eventually falls down. I patted his cheek, watching him flinch. Dinner is in the oven. Try not to burn it. I have some more reading to do. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight, the sound echoing through the tension-filled living room. Preston was still pacing, nursing his third scotch, trying to process the fact that his wife had just humiliated him with a lecture on macroeconomics. He looked like a man whose reality was cracking around the edges. He was angry, yes, but mostly he was unsettled. He kept glancing at me, waiting for the mask to slip, waiting for the stuttering, apologetic Monique to return. But she was not coming back. The silence was broken by a sharp, aggressive vibration. Preston's phone, which was sitting face up on the marble coffee table, lit up. It was a single notification, piercing the gloom of the room. Preston lunged for it. His reaction was visceral, desperate. It was the reaction of a man with secrets, but he was not fast enough. I have trained my eyes to catch details in milliseconds. Before his hand could cover the screen, I saw it. The contact name read, Ashley, VP of Operations. But the message preview was definitely not corporate. Can't wait for our strategy session at the hotel tomorrow. Wear the blue tie. It looks good on the floor. Preston snatched the phone, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. He quickly angled the screen away from me, his thumbs flying across the glass as he typed a frantic reply. He looked up, his eyes darting nervously. Work emergency, he muttered, his voice tight. The Asian markets are opening. There is a liquidity crisis in Tokyo. I have to handle it. I sat there swirling the amber liquid in my glass. I did not say a word. I did not ask who Ashley was. I did not ask why the VP of Operations was texting him at midnight about his tie. Monique would have asked. Monique would have begged for reassurance. Monique would have believed him when he lied. But I simply smiled. It was a small, cold smile that he was too panicked to notice. I knew the organizational chart of Sterling Capital better than he did. I had memorized it 3 hours ago. There was no VP of Operations named Ashley. There was, however, a 23-year-old executive assistant named Ashley Miller, a blonde, recent graduate. I watched him shove the phone into his pocket, his hand lingering there protectively. He was sweating. Go ahead, darling, I said, my voice smooth as silk. You should definitely go handle that. You would not want to leave your VP waiting. Strategy sessions can be so demanding. He looked at me sharply, searching my face for sarcasm, for a hint that I knew. But I gave him nothing, just a placid, supportive stare. He exhaled, relieved that he had gotten away with it. I will be in the study, he said, turning his back on me. Do not wait up. I watched him hurry out of the room, running to call his mistress. I took a final sip of my drink and set the glass down. The financial fraud was good leverage. But an affair with a subordinate, that was the kill shot. I had the money. Now I had the morals. Found you, I whispered to the empty room. I pulled out my own phone and opened the tracking software I had installed on his device while he was in the shower 2 days ago. I saw the blue dot moving toward the study. I saw the outgoing call to a number that was definitely not in Tokyo. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The game had just become a lot more interesting. He thought he was the hunter sneaking around in the dark. He had no idea he was just another line item on my audit. And I was about to close the account. The next morning I drove straight to the glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, where Sterling Capital occupied the top 3 floors. I walked through the lobby like I owned the building, my heels clicking a sharp rhythm on the polished floors. I was wearing the blood-red suit I had purchased the day before, and I looked nothing like the mousy housewife Preston thought he had left at home. I breezed past the security desk, flashing a smile that was more of a warning than a greeting. I knew exactly where I was going. I had studied the floor plan on the company website. I took the private elevator up to the 40th floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into the hushed, expensive atmosphere of high finance. Ashley Miller's desk was situated right outside Preston's corner office, acting as a gatekeeper. She looked exactly as I expected, blonde, polished, and terrified. She was wearing a dress that was slightly too tight for a corporate environment, the kind of outfit worn by a woman who is trying to secure a promotion through extracurricular activities. She looked up as I approached, her eyes widening. She recognized me, or at least she recognized the ring on my finger. "Mrs. Sterling," she stammered, half rising from her chair. "I did not know you were coming in. Mr. Sterling is in a meeting right now." I waved my hand dismissively. "Sit down, Ashley. I am not here to see my husband. I am here to see you." Ashley went pale. She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. She clearly thought I was here to make a scene. She thought I was going to scream, throw things, or drag her by her hair. She was bracing for the angry wife routine. I leaned against her desk and gave her my warmest, most sympathetic smile. It was the kind of smile a shark gives a seal before dinner. "I just wanted to thank you," I said softly. Ashley blinked, confused. "Thank me?" "Yes," I continued, keeping my voice low and conspiratorial. "Preston has told me how supportive you have been. He says you are his rock at the office. And honestly, with everything that is happening, I am just so relieved he has someone like you." "Everything that is happening," she repeated, her voice trembling. I widened my eyes in fake surprise. "Oh, he hasn't told you. I suppose he wouldn't want to worry you. He is so noble like that." I leaned in closer, whispering now. "The SEC investigation, Ashley. The liquidity crisis. It is a nightmare. The lawyers called the house last night. They are talking about freezing all his assets by Friday. The bank accounts, the cars, the penthouse. Everything is going to be seized to pay off the investors." I watched the blood drain from her face. Ashley was not in this for love, she was in this for the lifestyle. And I had just told her the lifestyle was about to be repossessed. It is going to be such a hard adjustment for him. I sighed, examining my manicure. "We are losing the house in Westport, of course. I am moving back in with my parents until the trial is over. But Preston, he is too proud for that. That is why I am so glad he has you." I reached out and patted her cold hand. "He is going to need a place to stay starting next week. I hope you have a comfortable couch in your apartment. And you might need to cover his legal fees for a while. He is used to the best lawyers. It is going to be expensive, but I know you love him enough to make that sacrifice." I stood up, adjusting my blazer. Ashley looked like she was about to be sick. The fantasy of the rich boyfriend had just shattered, replaced by the reality of a broke, homeless fugitive. "Well, I should run," I said brightly. "I have to go meet the bankruptcy attorney." "It was lovely to meet you, Ashley. Take good care of him. He is going to be very needy for the next few years." I walked toward the elevator without looking back. Behind me, I could practically hear the gears in her head turning, calculating how fast she could run in the opposite direction. I had not just neutralized the mistress, I had turned her into a liability for Preston. And the best part was, I hadn't even raised my voice. By the time Preston returned home that evening, the seed I had planted in Ashley's mind had blossomed into a full-blown forest fire. He did not storm in with his usual arrogance. He dragged himself through the door, looking like a man who had gone 12 rounds with a heavyweight boxer. His tie was undone, his hair was disheveled, and there was a frantic, hunted look in his eyes. I was sitting in the living room, calmly reviewing the latest photos of his offshore ledgers on my tablet. I swiped the screen to a recipe for roast chicken as he entered. "Hello, darling," I said, keeping my voice light and innocent. "You look exhausted." Was it a difficult day at the office? Preston walked straight to the bar and poured himself a triple scotch. His hand was shaking so badly the crystal decanter rattled against the glass. "Difficult does not even begin to describe it," he muttered, downing half the drink in one gulp. He turned to look at me, his eyes narrowing. "Did you speak to anyone today, Monique? Did you go into the city?" I blinked, feigning confusion. "Me? No, Preston. I went to the dry cleaners and then I came straight home." "Why do you ask?" He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the expensive Persian rug. "Because my executive assistant has lost her mind," he shouted, unable to contain his frustration. Ashley came into my office after lunch and demanded $100,000 in cash. She said she needs security. She said she heard rumors that the firm is going under and that I am about to be indicted. I gasped, bringing a hand to my chest in mock horror. Oh no, Preston. That is terrible. Why would she think such a thing? I do not know, he yelled, throwing his hands up. She was hysterical. She said she isn't going to be left holding the bag. She threatened to go to HR if I didn't transfer the money by Friday. She is supposed to be the loyal one. She is supposed to be grateful for the opportunity I gave her. Now suddenly she is acting like a mercenary. I watched him unravel, fighting the urge to laugh. It was a beautiful thing to witness. The misogynist who thought he could control women with money was now being squeezed by the very transactional nature he had cultivated. Ashley didn't love him. She loved his wallet. And now that she thought the wallet was empty, she was clawing for the last few scraps. Maybe you should just pay her, I suggested softly. If she is that upset, you do not want her making a scene. 100,000 is not that much to you, is it? Unless there is a cash flow problem I do not know about. Preston froze. He looked at me, his face pale. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He didn't have the cash. His money was tied up in illegal offshore accounts or leveraged in risky bets. He was liquidity poor. I do not have a cash flow problem, he snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. It is the principle of the matter. I will not be blackmailed by a 23-year-old girl. He poured another drink, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit. He was trapped. His wife was spending his credit line, his mistress was demanding his cash, and he was terrified that the FBI was knocking on his door. He was losing control of every woman in his life, and he had absolutely no idea that the architect of his destruction was sitting 5 feet away asking him what he wanted for dinner. Friday night was not just a dinner party, it was a rescue mission for Preston's crumbling empire. The managing partners from a major sovereign wealth fund were flying in, and Preston needed them to sign a $50 million capital injection to cover the hole I had found in his books. He was a nervous wreck. He had spent an hour screaming at the caterers about the temperature of the crab cakes and another hour fixing his tie in the mirror. He was sweating through his deodorant before the first guest even rang the doorbell. He cornered me in the hallway just before the guests arrived. He gripped my upper arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of my silk robe. Listen to me closely, Monique. He hissed, his eyes manic. Tonight is not about you. It is not about your new clothes or your sudden little interest in finance. These men are serious. They do not want to hear your opinions on the weather. You smile, you pour drinks, you look pretty, and you keep your mouth shut. Do you understand me? If you embarrass me tonight, Monique, I swear I will make you regret it. I looked at his hand on my arm, then up at his eyes. I did not pull away. I just stared at him until he let go, unsettled by the absolute lack of fear in my gaze. I understand perfectly, Preston, I said, my voice calm and deadly. I will be the perfect wife. He exhaled, adjusting his cuffs, and went downstairs to greet the money. I went into the dressing room to prepare for war. 10 minutes later, I walked down the grand staircase. I had chosen a gown that was a declaration of independence. It was a floor-length sheath of midnight blue velvet backless, and structured, clinging to every curve like liquid armor. It was elegant, expensive, and intimidating. I wore a diamond choker that I had purchased with his corporate card that morning. It glittered under the chandelier light, cold and hard. The living room was full of men in gray suits holding tumblers of scotch, discussing market volatility in low, serious voices. When my stiletto heel struck the marble floor of the foyer, the conversation died instantly. Every head turned. Preston, who was in the middle of a forced laugh, froze. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw pure, unadulterated lust mix with his fear. He had never seen Monique look like this. He had never seen her hold her head high, shoulders back, radiating power instead of apology. I walked straight into the center of the circle. I did not wait for Preston to introduce me. I did not wait to be invited. I extended my hand to the most senior partner, a formidable man named Mr. Henderson, whom Preston had been terrified of all week. Mr. Henderson. I said, my voice rich and confident, projecting to the back of the room. It is a pleasure to finally welcome you to our home. Preston has told me so much about your aggressive acquisition strategy in the emerging markets. I have been dying to ask you about the liquidity ratios you are targeting for the next quarter. Mr. Henderson looked stunned. He took my hand, blinking rapidly. Well, Mrs. Sterling, he stammered, clearly charmed. I did not realize you followed the markets. I smiled, and it was the smile of a wolf sitting down to dinner. Oh, I follow everything, Mr. Henderson, especially the things people think are hidden. Preston choked on his drink behind me. The night had just begun, and he had already lost the room. We moved to the dining room where the long mahogany table was set with Preston's grandmother's silver. Preston took the head of the table naturally, and I sat to his right. The air was thick with the smell of roasted duck and desperation. Preston was pouring wine a little too generously, his laugh a little too loud. He was trying to charm these men, but I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. He knew he was drowning, and he was praying that a few expensive bottles of Bordeaux would act as a life raft. Mr. Henderson cut into his duck, chewed thoughtfully, and then looked straight at Preston. The pleasantries were over. It was time for business. Preston, he said, his voice gravelly and serious. We have been reviewing the quarterly projections. The board is concerned about the exposure in the emerging market sector, specifically regarding the currency volatility in Southeast Asia. If the central banks hike rates next month as predicted, your current leverage ratio looks dangerous. How exactly are you planning to mitigate that risk without liquidating the core assets? Preston froze. He wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, buying time. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He had no plan. He had been betting on the rates staying low. He was gambling, not investing. Well, Preston began, flashing a charming, empty smile. It is a valid concern, Charles, but I can assure you our fundamentals are robust. We are taking a very proactive approach. We have synergies in place. We are monitoring the situation hour by hour. It is all about confidence. The market reacts to confidence, and we are very confident. It was a non-answer. A word salad of corporate buzzwords meant to hide incompetence. Mr. Henderson frowned, clearly unimpressed. He opened his mouth to press for details, but I spoke first. Actually, darling, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a diamond cutter. I think what Charles is asking is slightly more specific. He wants to know if you are still relying on unhedged currency swaps. Preston turned to look at me, his eyes bulging. He looked like he wanted to reach across the table and strangle me. Monique, he warned, his voice tight. This is a complex matter. I ignored him and turned my dazzling smile on Mr. Henderson. You see, Charles Preston is too modest to bore you with the math. But the truth is, the firm's exposure is currently 40% in unhedged positions. However, if the rates hike by even 50 basis points, that leverage becomes toxic. A proactive approach would not be monitoring the situation. A proactive approach would be purchasing put options on the currency index to cap the downside. Isn't that right, Preston? Or are you still hoping the market will just be nice to you? The silence that followed was deafening. Every fork at the table stopped moving. Mr. Henderson looked from Preston, who was now pale and sweating, to me. He looked at me with a newfound respect bordering on awe. That is exactly right, Mrs. Sterling, Henderson said, ignoring Preston completely. Put options would be the only logical hedge. I am surprised Preston did not mention that. Tell me, where did you study economics? Wharton, London School of Economics? I took a delicate sip of my wine, enjoying the taste of Preston's humiliation. Oh, I never went to business school, Charles. I am just a housewife. I just read my husband's files when he leaves them lying around. I find the numbers so fascinating. They tell stories, don't they? Sometimes they even tell secrets. Preston gripped his wine glass so hard I thought it would shatter. He had lost control of the narrative. He had lost control of the room. And worst of all, he realized that the person sitting to his right was not his wife. She was his replacement. The drive home was a blur of speed and terrifying silence. Preston took the corners of the winding country road at 60 miles per hour, the tires of the Porsche screaming in protest against the asphalt. I sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, watching the trees blur past like dark ghosts in the headlights. I could feel the heat radiating off him. He was vibrating with rage, a pressure cooker that had been building steam for 3 hours and was finally ready to explode. He had spent the entire evening being corrected by his wife, the woman he considered his property, and the bruise on his ego was far more painful than any physical blow. Suddenly he slammed his hand against the steering wheel, the sound cracking like a whip in the confined space of the luxury car. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he screamed, his voice raw and unrecognizable. "You think you are smart because you memorized a few vocabulary words. You humiliated me, Monique. You made me look like a fool in front of the biggest capital source in New York. You sat there and corrected me like I was a child." I kept my voice calm, almost bored. I turned to face him, the passing streetlights casting intermittent shadows across my face. "I did not make you look like a fool, Preston. I made you look competent. If I had not stepped in, Henderson would have realized you are leveraging his money on a coin toss. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you," he roared. He slammed on the brakes. The car swerved violently to the right, the tires tearing up the gravel as he pulled onto the dark shoulder of the deserted road. The force of the stop threw me forward against the seatbelt, locking it tight against my chest. The engine idled aggressively, the only sound cutting through the chirping of crickets outside in the pitch-black woods. Preston unbuckled his seatbelt with shaking, frantic hands. He turned his entire body toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was not the businessman anymore. This was the abuser. This was the man who liked to break things when he felt small. "You need a lesson," he spat, saliva flying from his mouth. "I have been too soft on you. I let you walk around in those expensive clothes pretending you are someone important. But underneath it all, you are just a stupid, useless little girl who needs to be told when to speak. You think you can talk back to me. You think you can undermine me in my own house." He raised his hand. It was a practiced motion, a heavy backhand swing designed to hurt and humiliate without leaving marks that a suit wouldn't cover. He breathed heavily, his eyes wild with the anticipation of violence. I watched his hand rise. I saw the intent in his eyes. He expected me to cower against the door. He expected the tears. He expected the apology. He thought he was alone in the car with his victim. He thought he was safe to purge his anger on the only person who couldn't fight back. He had no idea he was locked in a cage with a predator. I did not shrink away. I shifted my weight slightly, planting my feet firmly on the floor mat. My muscles coiled, ready to release the energy I had been holding back for days. "Do it," I said softly, staring straight into his eyes without blinking. "Swing, Preston, but make sure you don't miss, because this is the last time you will ever raise a hand to anyone." He didn't listen. He lunged across the center console, his fist flying toward my face. The fist came fast, a blur of knuckles aimed straight for my cheekbone. In his mind, Preston had already made contact. He expected the sickening sound of impact, the cry of pain, the satisfaction of reasserting his dominance. But he was fighting a memory. He was fighting the ghost of the woman he had broken. He was not fighting me. I did not flinch. I did not blink. Krav Maga is not about brute strength. It is about physics and leverage. As his arm extended, I raised my left forearm, deflecting the blow upward, barely missing my ear. Before he could retract his arm, I lunged. My hand shot out and clamped around his wrist like a steel trap. I used his own momentum against him. I pulled his arm forward while simultaneously driving my shoulder into his chest. The space inside the Porsche was tight, but that worked in my favor. I twisted his wrist outward, locking the joint, and wrenched his arm violently behind the passenger headrest. Preston screamed. It was not a roar of anger anymore. It was a high-pitched yelp of pure white-hot pain. I did not stop. I drove my other hand into the pressure point at the base of his neck, forcing his face down into the leather of the steering wheel. I pinned him there, His arm twisted at an agonizing angle behind him, his cheek pressed against the horn, which let out a short, muffled honk, before I pulled him back slightly. "Stop!" he shrieked, his legs kicking uselessly against the floor mats. "You are breaking my arm!" I leaned in close, my lips brushing against his ear. I could smell the sweat and the fear pouring off him. I tightened my grip on his wrist, feeling the tendons strain under my fingers. One more inch and I would dislocate his shoulder. "Listen to me, Preston," I whispered, my voice dropping to a register that was colder than the grave. "I am going to say this once. If you ever raise a hand to me again, if you ever even think about hurting me, I will not just block it. I will snap your wrist like a dry twig." I yanked his arm higher, eliciting another gasp of agony from him. "Do you understand me?" I asked, tightening the lock. "Yes," he sobbed. "Yes. Let go." I released him abruptly. He fell back against the driver's seat, clutching his shoulder, his chest heaving. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. He was trembling. The bully had vanished, replaced by a frightened child who had just realized the playground rules had changed. I smoothed my velvet dress and sat back in my seat, looking perfectly composed. "Start the car, Preston," I said, staring straight ahead at the dark road. "And drive carefully. Touch me again and you will be driving with your teeth." Preston did not say a word. He reached for the ignition with a shaking hand. He pulled the car back onto the road, driving 10 miles under the speed limit, flinching every time I shifted in my seat. He kept glancing at me, trying to reconcile the woman he married with the weapon sitting next to him. He was trapped in a metal box with a monster, and for the first time in his life, he was praying for the drive to end. The rest of the drive home was performed in a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush the roof of the car. Preston gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled desperation, his eyes fixed on the road, refusing to look at me. Every time I shifted my weight or adjusted my seatbelt, he flinched. The man who had terrorized my sister for a decade was now terrified of his own shadow. We pulled into the driveway, and for the first time ever, he did not wait for me to get out and open the front door for him. He practically scrambled out of the car, clutching his throbbing shoulder, and rushed toward the house as if the devil himself were nipping at his heels. I followed him at a leisurely pace, the gravel crunching softly under my heels. When I entered the foyer, Preston was standing by the stairs, looking at me with a mixture of horror and confusion. He was trying to rationalize what had just happened. In his small, misogynistic world, women were weak, wives were submissive. Therefore, the creature who had just nearly snapped his arm in half could not possibly be his wife. I saw the wheels turning in his head. He was looking for an explanation that did not involve him being a coward. Was I on drugs? Was I having a psychotic break? Or was it something darker? He looked at my eyes, searching for the Monique he knew, but all he found was a cold, black void. I could see the superstitious fear creeping in. He was wondering if I was possessed. He was wondering if the woman standing in his hallway was human at all. "I am going to bed," I said, taking a step toward the stairs. My voice was normal calm, which seemed to frighten him even more than the screaming. "Are you coming, Preston?" He backed away, stumbling slightly against the banister. He held his injured arm against his chest protectively. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Number 1, I have work to do. I am sleeping in the guest room tonight." I paused on the third step and looked down at him. "The guest room?" I repeated slowly. "But the master bed is so much more comfortable. And I thought you liked to keep an eye on me. I do not want to be near you." He blurted out, sweat beading on his forehead. "You are not right. Something is wrong with you, Monique. You are sick. You are dangerous." I smiled, and I let the smile linger just a little too long. "Maybe I am just finally myself, Preston." He didn't answer. He turned and bolted toward the guest wing of the house. A moment later, I heard the sound I had been waiting for, the heavy click of a deadbolt sliding into place. I walked up the stairs to the master bedroom, the room that had been my sister's prison cell. I stripped off the velvet gown and lay down in the center of the massive bed. I stretched out my limbs, taking up as much space as possible. For the first time in 10 years, Monique's bed was a safe place. Down the hall, her tormentor was huddled under a blanket, locking his door against his own wife, wondering if he was going insane. He wasn't insane yet, but give me a few more days, and he would be. The house was silent, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first shot has been fired. Down the hall behind the locked door of the guest suite, I could hear the faint, pathetic sounds of Preston pacing. He was calling someone, his voice muffled and frantic, probably his lawyer or his mother. He was distracted. He was terrified. And he was completely unaware that the real threat was not sleeping in the master bedroom, but sitting at his desk in the study. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I preferred the blue glow of the monitors. I sat in his leather chair, the same chair where he had planned his financial crimes, and I produced a military-grade external hard drive from my pocket. This was not a simple copy and paste job. I was not just taking a few files. I was initiating a forensic mirror of his entire system. I plugged the drive into the port and launched my decryption software. Preston had paid thousands of dollars for cybersecurity, but he had made the classic mistake of arrogance. He assumed the person trying to break in would be an outsider hacking through a firewall, not his wife sitting at his keyboard with administrative access. My fingers flew across the keys, bypassing his encryption protocols with insulting ease. The progress bar appeared on the screen, a green line crawling slowly from left to right. I watched it with the intensity of a predator watching a pulse. Every percentage point was another nail in his coffin. As the data transferred, I opened the shadow logs. These were the files he thought he had deleted. The emails he had sent to the Caymans at 3 in the morning. The wire transfers he had disguised as vendor payments. I saw it all. It was worse than I thought. This was not just tax evasion. This was full-blown money laundering. He was washing cash for entities that were definitely not on the list of approved trading partners. I saw transfers to shell companies in Cyprus, Malta, and Panama. I saw a $10 million loan from a bank that did not exist. I felt a cold shiver of satisfaction run down my spine. This was it. This was the smoking gun. With this hard drive, I could not just divorce him. I could bury him. I could send him to a federal prison for 20 years. I could strip him of every dime, every asset, every shred of dignity he had left. The computer beeped softly. The transfer was complete. I ejected the drive and held it in my hand. It was small, cold, and heavy. It weighed less than 1/4 of a pound, but it contained the entire destruction of the Sterling dynasty. I stood up and slipped the drive into my bra right next to my heart. It was the most romantic thing I had ever worn. I shut down the computer, wiped my fingerprints from the keyboard with the hem of my silk robe, and walked to the door. I paused and looked back at the dark room. It looked the same as it always had. The expensive books, the mahogany desk, the smell of old money. But it was a crime scene now, and I was the detective who had just solved the case. I walked back upstairs, passing Preston's door. I heard the springs of the guest bed creak as he tossed and turned. "Sleep tight, darling," I whispered into the darkness, "because tomorrow the nightmare really begins." The next morning, the atmosphere in the house shifted from terrified silence to a cold, calculated offensive. I came downstairs to find Preston sitting at the dining table. He wasn't alone. His mother, Victoria, was there sipping herbal tea and looking at me with the expression of a woman who had just ordered a pest exterminator. Between them sat a thick stack of legal documents. I poured myself a coffee and leaned against the doorframe, waiting. I knew this move. This was the Empire Strikes Back. Preston didn't have the spine to confront me alone after the incident in the car, so he had brought in the heavy artillery. "Monique, sit down," Victoria commanded, pointing to a chair. "We need to have a family discussion regarding the future of this marriage." I didn't sit. I stayed standing, sipping my coffee. "I am comfortable here, Victoria." "What is the agenda?" Preston cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. He pushed the documents across the polished mahogany table toward me. "Mother and I have been talking," he said, his voice trying to sound authoritative but wavering slightly at the edges. Your behavior lately has been erratic, unstable. You have been spending money recklessly, making scenes in public and threatening me. I raised an eyebrow. Threatening you? I thought we were just having a spirited debate about interest rates. Victoria cut in, her voice like ice. Do not play games, Monique. We know what you are doing. You are positioning yourself for a divorce. You think you can act out, make Preston look bad, and then walk away with half the sterling fortune. Well, we are not going to let that happen. She tapped a manicured fingernail on the paper stack. This is a post-nuptial agreement. It states that in the event of a divorce for any reason, you waive your right to spousal support, you waive your claim to any real estate, and you waive your interest in any future earnings of sterling capital. Essentially, if you leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. I walked over to the table and picked up the document. I flipped through the pages. It was brutal. It was a legal straitjacket designed to strip a woman of her dignity and her future. It was the kind of contract you sign when you are a prisoner, not a partner. Preston finally looked up at me, gaining confidence from his mother's presence. If you want to stay in this marriage, if you want to keep living in this house, you will sign that today. It is a show of good faith. It proves that you are here for me, not for the money. I looked at him, then at Victoria. They looked so smug. They thought they had cornered me. They thought that by threatening me with poverty, they could force me back into submission. They had no idea that to a woman like me, this document wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. So let me get this straight, I said slowly, placing the paper back on the table. You want me to sign away my rights to prove my loyalty. And if I sign this, everything goes back to normal. Victoria smiled, a thin, cruel curving of her lips. Exactly. You sign and we forget this little rebellious phase ever happened. You go back to being a good wife, and we continue to take care of you. I looked at the pen lying next to the document. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and expensive. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hand. They were handing me the weapon I would use to slit their throats, and they were too arrogant to see the blade. I held the Mont Blanc pen, staring at the gold nib. They were waiting for a fight. They were waiting for the forensic accountant to tear the contract apart clause by clause. So I gave them exactly what they did not expect. I gave them Monique. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing my posture until I looked small and defeated. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I thought about the saddest thing I could imagine, which was the wasted decade my sister had spent with these monsters, and I let the tears well up in my eyes. I dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the mahogany table. I buried my face in my hands and let out a sob that sounded broken and pathetic. I do not want your money, Preston, I cried, my voice muffled by my palms. I do not care about the house. I do not care about the assets. I just want us to be happy again. I just want my husband back. Why are you doing this to me? I peeked through my fingers. The tension in the room vanished instantly. Victoria sat back in her chair, a look of triumphant disgust on her face. Preston exhaled a long breath, his shoulders relaxing. This was the dynamic they understood. This was the woman they knew how to control. The terrifying, confident stranger had disappeared, and the weeping victim had returned. Victoria took a sip of her tea. Oh, for heaven's sake, stop crying, Monique. It is embarrassing. We are not trying to hurt you. We are protecting the family legacy. If you really love Preston, you will sign the paper and stop this theatrics. I looked up, wiping my wet cheeks with the back of my hand. I looked at Preston with wide, pleading eyes. If I sign this, will you promise not to leave me? Will you promise that we can start over? Preston smiled. It was the smile of a man who thinks he has regained the upper hand. Of course, darling. Sign it and we can put this whole ugly week behind us. I will even take you to Paris next month, just the two of us. I reached for the pen again, my hand trembling violently. I brought the tip to the paper, then stopped. I pulled my hand back, shaking my head. I cannot, I whispered. Look at me. I am a mess. My hands are shaking too much. I cannot even read the words through these tears. I pushed the chair back and stood up, clutching the document to my chest like a lifeline. Please, Preston, let me take this upstairs. Let me calm down, wash my face, and read it in private. I promise I will sign it. I just need tonight to say goodbye to the past. I will have it signed and on your desk first thing tomorrow morning. Preston exchanged a look with his mother. Victoria shrugged, clearly bored with my emotional display. Let her go, Preston. She is broken. She will sign. Preston nodded at me, his arrogance fully restored. Fine. Tomorrow morning, Monique. No excuses. Thank you, I whispered. I turned and walked out of the room, keeping my head down, letting my shoulders shake as if I were sobbing. But the moment I turned the corner and started up the stairs, the tears stopped instantly. I straightened my back, I wiped my face, I had the document, I had the deadline, and most importantly, I had lulled them into a coma of complacency. They thought I was upstairs crying over a marriage. I was actually going upstairs to rewrite a contract. The house was a tomb, silent and cold, but my mind was a supercomputer running at maximum capacity. It was 3 in the morning. Preston was asleep in the guest room, dreaming of his victory. He thought the war was over because I had surrendered. He did not realize that I was currently rewriting the terms of the peace treaty. I sat in the glow of my laptop screen, the only light in the master bedroom. I was not hacking into the Pentagon. I was hacking into the email server of a boutique law firm in Connecticut. Preston's lawyer, a man named Harrison, who charged $600 an hour to be mediocre, had sent the final draft of the post-nuptial agreement at 5 in the afternoon. It was sitting in Preston's inbox unread, waiting for him to print it in the morning. I accessed Preston's email account. It was pathetically easy since his password was the name of his first yacht. I found the email from Harrison. Subject line: final draft for signature. Attached was a 20-page PDF designed to ruin my life. I downloaded the file and opened it. I ran it through a converter to unlock the editing permissions. I scrolled past the preamble, past the definitions of assets, until I reached Section 4, Subsection B. This was the clause that stated in the event of a divorce, the wife would receive 0 alimony and vacate the marital home within 30 days. I highlighted the paragraph and hit delete. The cursor blinked on the empty white space waiting for my command. I began to type. I matched the font perfectly. Garamond size 12. I matched the justification and the line spacing. To the naked eye, the page looked exactly the same as before, but the words were very, very different. I drafted a new clause using the precise legal terminology I had learned from forensic audits of messy divorces. I typed that in the event of proven infidelity or documented physical abuse, the standard division of assets would be null and void. Instead, the spouse categorized as the victim would be entitled to 80% of all marital assets, both liquid and fixed. And then I added the cherry on top. I added a line granting the victim immediate controlling interest and voting rights in any family-owned business entities, specifically Sterling Capital. I read it over. It was a death sentence disguised as a contract. I saved the file as a PDF, ensuring the metadata matched the original creation time. I re-uploaded it to a spoofed email address that looked identical to Harrison's firm. I went into Preston's inbox, permanently deleted the real email from the lawyer, and replaced it with my fabricated one. I changed the subject line slightly to ensure he would not look too closely. I typed final version, minor formatting corrections. Men like Preston do not read documents twice. He had already read the draft yesterday. He would see the subject line, assume his lawyer had just fixed a margin error, and hit print. He was going to sign his entire life away, and he was going to hand me the pen to do it. I closed the laptop and lay back on the pillows. I had never slept so soundly in my life. The trap was set, and the rat was already sniffing the cheese. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the dining room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. To Preston and Victoria, it looked like the dawn of a new era of control. To me, it looked like the spotlight on a stage where the final act was about to begin. The document sat in the center of the table. It was thick, crisp, and stapled in the corner. It was the physical manifestation of my midnight hacking session fresh from the printer. Preston was already seated drinking his espresso. He looked refreshed. The fear from the car ride and the paranoia from the night before had evaporated, replaced by his default setting of smug superiority. He tapped the paper with his index finger as I entered the room. "Good morning, Monique," he said, his voice brisk and businesslike. "I printed the final copy Harrison sent over this morning. He just cleaned up some formatting. Standard procedure. I have already signed my portion. Now it is your turn." He pushed the document toward me along with the Mont Blanc pen. He had flipped it straight to the last page to the signature line. He had not read a single word of the text. He had not checked the clauses. He assumed that because the email came from his lawyer's address, the content was safe. He was so confident in his power, so sure of my submission, that he didn't feel the need to verify the terms of his own life. I sat down slowly. I reached for the document, but I didn't pick up the pen immediately. I turned the document over and opened it to the first page. Preston sighed, checking his Rolex. "Monique, please. We went over this yesterday. Do not drag this out. I have a meeting in the city at 10. "I am just admiring the legal work, Preston," I said softly. "It is very thorough." I flipped through the pages, my heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I passed the preamble. I passed the asset definitions. And then I saw it. Section 4, subsection B, the trap I had set in the middle of the night. It was right there, printed in black and white, legally binding the moment the ink touched the paper. It stated clearly that any evidence of infidelity or physical abuse would transfer 80% of all assets and controlling interest of Sterling Capital to the wife. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever read. I turned to the last page. Preston's signature was already there, a jagged, arrogant scrawl. He had already walked into the cage. He was just waiting for me to lock the door. I picked up the pen. I looked at Victoria, who was watching me with a hawk-like stare. She gave me a curt nod, urging me to sign my life away. She thought she was winning. She thought she had secured her son's fortune. I lowered the pen to the paper. The nib scratched against the fiber as I wrote Monique Sterling in cursive. It was done. The contract was sealed. I capped the pen and set it down with a definitive click. "There," I said, pushing the papers back to him. "All done." Preston snatched the document up, a grin spreading across his face. He looked like a man who had just dodged a bullet, unaware he had just strapped a bomb to his chest. "Good girl," he said, standing up and sliding the contract into his briefcase. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Now we can get back to normal." I looked up at him, and for the first time I let the mask slip completely. I didn't look sad. I didn't look scared. I smiled. It was a slow, dangerous smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Yes, Preston," I said, my voice low and vibrating with amusement. "Everything is going to be exactly the way it should be." He frowned, slightly unsettled by my expression, but he didn't have time to analyze it. He grabbed his briefcase and hurried out the door, eager to file the document that would seal his fate. I stayed at the table, listening to the sound of his Porsche pulling out of the driveway. He was driving to the lawyer's office to file his own death warrant. Here is the script for segment 27, written in English, optimized for AI voice reading, with a chaotic, dramatic, and triumphant tone. It follows your specific instructions. Continuous flow, no special characters, and strictly adhering to the plot points of segment 27. The ink on the post-nuptial agreement had barely dried when the doorbell rang. It was not the polite chime of a guest, but a frantic, insistent buzzing that echoed through the foyer like an alarm. It was Saturday afternoon. Preston was in the living room nursing a scotch, celebrating his legal victory, while Victoria critiqued the flower arrangements. I was sitting by the window waiting. I knew the timing was perfect. I had anonymously texted Ashley from a burner phone an hour ago, telling her that Preston was planning to flee the country with his wife to avoid the fake indictment. The housekeeper opened the door, and Ashley Miller stormed in. She looked nothing like the polished executive assistant I had met at the office. Her hair was wild, her mascara was smudged, and she was wearing a coat over her pajamas. She pushed past the housekeeper and marched straight into the living room, her eyes scanning the space until they landed on Preston. Preston stood up, spilling his drink. Ashley, he stammered, looking from her to me in panic. "What are you doing here? Get out! You cannot be here!" Ashley did not leave. She reached into her bag and slammed a crumpled piece of paper onto the coffee table. It landed right next to Victoria's teacup. "I am not going anywhere, Preston!" She screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You think you can just ignore my calls? You think you can leave me behind while you run off to Europe? Well, you can't, because I am carrying your child." The room went dead silent. The air was sucked out of the space. Victoria dropped her teaspoon. It clattered against the china with a sharp ping. Preston turned the color of ash. He looked at the paper, then at Ashley's stomach, and finally, with slow dawning horror, he looked at me. He wasn't thinking about the baby. He wasn't thinking about the scandal. He was thinking about the document he had signed less than 24 hours ago. The document that gave me everything if he was caught cheating. "You are lying!" Preston hissed, his voice shaking. "You are crazy! Get out of my house before I call the police!" "I am not lying," Ashley sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at him. "I have the test results. I am 6 weeks pregnant. You said you loved me. You said your wife was a frigid bore and that you were going to leave her. So be a man and do it. Divorce her." Victoria stood up, her face twisting in disgust. She looked at Ashley as if she were a cockroach crawling across her expensive rug. "Preston, explain this immediately. Who is this hysterical trash, and why is she claiming to carry a sterling heir?" I stood up slowly. This was my cue. I needed to play the part of the devastated wife one last time to make the breach of contract undeniable. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the paper. It was a lab report from a clinic in the city. "Positive. Is this true, Preston?" I asked, my voice trembling with fake sorrow. I looked him dead in the eye. "Have you been sleeping with her?" Preston opened his mouth to deny it, but Ashley cut him off. "Of course he has," she yelled. "For 6 months, everyone in the office knows. That was all I needed. A verbal confession in front of witnesses." I dropped the paper and looked at Preston. The sadness vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, hard satisfaction. "Well, congratulations, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to its natural commanding pitch. "You finally created something. It is a shame you won't be able to afford to raise it." Preston realized then that the trap had snapped shut. He lunged toward me. "Monique, wait," he begged. "It is not what you think." I stepped back out of his reach. "It is exactly what I think I said. And thanks to that contract you signed this morning, this house, your accounts, and your company now belong to me." I turned to Ashley. "He is all yours, honey. I hope you like men with no money, because I just took it all." Preston laughed. It was a ragged, nervous sound that cracked in the middle. He looked around the room, expecting the walls to stop spinning. "You are delusional," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have nothing. You signed the post-nup this morning. I have the copy right here in my briefcase. You agreed to leave with 0 assets. You agreed to walk away with nothing but your pride." I walked over to the sideboard and poured myself a glass of water. My movements were slow, deliberate, mocking his panic. I turned to face him, leaning back against the wood. "You really should have read the fine print, Preston." Preston scrambled for his briefcase, which was sitting on the hallway table where he had left it. He tore the leather straps open, his hands fumbling, and ripped the document out. He flipped through the pages, frantically tearing the paper in his haste. Victoria stood over his shoulder, her face pale, sensing the catastrophe before she even saw the words. "Page 14, I said, taking a sip of water. "Section 4, subsection B. Read it out loud. Preston, I want your mother to hear it." Preston found the page, his eyes scanned the text. He froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He blinked, shaking his head, as if the words would rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. But the black ink remained permanent. "Read it," I commanded, my voice snapping like a whip. Preston's voice was a whisper barely audible. "In the event of proven infidelity, witnessed by family members or documented by third parties, the standard division of assets is void. The victimized spouse is immediately entitled to 80% of all liquid and fixed assets, including controlling interest in sterling capital." Victoria snatched the paper from his hands. She read the clause, her eyes bulging. She turned to her son and slapped him across the face. The sound was loud and crisp. "You idiot!" she screamed. "You incompetent fool! You signed this. You signed away the company. You didn't read it." Preston held his cheek, staring at the paper in horror. "It wasn't there yesterday," he stammered. "I swear, it wasn't there. She changed it. She hacked it." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "Prove it," I said. "That is your signature, Preston. Not a forgery. You signed it in front of witnesses this morning, and just now in front of those same witnesses, your mistress confirmed that you have been sleeping with her for 6 months. That is the trigger event. The clause is active." I pulled my phone from my pocket and held up the screen. I had just sent a singular text message to the filing attorney. The text read, "Execute Protocol B. The deed is done." I said, my voice devoid of mercy. "My lawyers have already filed the executed contract with the court. They have placed a freeze on the corporate accounts pending the asset transfer. As of 5 minutes ago, I am the majority shareholder of Sterling Capital. I own this house. I own your car. I own the shirt on your back." Ashley, who had been watching this unfold with wide eyes, realized she had made a terrible mistake. She looked at Preston, then at me. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. "If you own everything, then he has nothing." I smiled at her. "Zero," I said. "He is bankrupt. And since you are carrying his child, I suppose that makes you the proud owner of his debt. Congratulations, Ashley. You played yourself." Preston sank onto the sofa, burying his head in his hands. The reality was crashing down on him. He wasn't just divorced. He was erased. The empire he had used to abuse and control everyone around him had just been weaponized, and the trigger had been pulled by the wife he thought was too stupid to read. The silence in the Sterling estate was thick enough to choke on. 3 days had passed since the contract detonated in Preston's face, and he was currently operating on a cocktail of denial and desperation. His lawyers were scrambling to file injunctions, trying to find a loophole in the trap I had set, but the freeze on his assets was absolute. He was a king without a treasury, but he still had one card left to play: public perception. He marched into the dressing room where I was sitting, holding a black tie in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other. He looked manic. The bags under his eyes were heavy, but he had plastered on a fake smile that looked more like a rictus of pain. "Get up, Monique," he commanded, though his voice lacked its usual thunder. "We are going to the midnight charity gala. The car is leaving in 40 minutes. I didn't turn around. I continued to brush my hair, watching his reflection in the mirror. "I thought we were bankrupt, Preston. Tickets to the gala are $10,000 a plate. Did you check under the sofa cushions for loose change?" He slammed the glass down on the vanity. "This is not a joke. The rumors about Ashley are spreading. The investors are nervous. If the stock price dips tomorrow, the board will vote to remove me before you even get your hands on the shares. I need to show them strength. I need to show them stability. I need to show them a happy, united family." He leaned down, his face close to mine. "You are going to put on your best dress. You are going to walk that red carpet on my arm. You are going to look at me like I am the sun and the moon. And you are going to save this company, because if the ship goes down, Monique, you drown with it." I stopped brushing my hair. I turned to look at him. He was pathetic. He truly believed that a photo op could reverse a federal investigation and a binding legal contract. He thought he was using me as a prop to prop up his failing reputation. He had no idea that I had been waiting for this night. I didn't want a private victory. I wanted a public execution. "I will go," I said softly. Relief washed over his face. He actually believed he had bullied me into submission one last time. "Good." He exhaled, straightening his tie. "Wear the blue silk. It makes you look demure." I waited until he left the room before I stood up. I walked past the blue silk dress. That was Monique's dress. It was the uniform of a victim. I went to the back of the closet and pulled out a garment bag I had hidden there days ago. I unzipped the bag. The fabric inside shimmered like molten metal. It was a gown of pure liquid gold, strapless and structured with a slit that ran up to the thigh. It was aggressive. It was loud. It was the kind of dress that didn't just ask for attention. It demanded submission. I slipped into the gown, feeling the cold silk against my skin. I applied my makeup with surgical precision. Dark, smoky eyes, a blood-red lip. I swept my hair back, exposing the sharp line of my jaw. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a wife. I saw a conqueror. I walked downstairs. Preston was waiting in the foyer, checking his watch. When he heard my footsteps, he looked up. His jaw dropped. He looked at the gold dress, at the way I held myself, and for a second, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. He realized, perhaps too late, that I wasn't coming to save him. I was coming to bury him. "You look expensive," he whispered, unsure if he should be angry or aroused. I walked past him, the gold fabric swishing softly like the sound of a blade being drawn. "Let's go, Preston. The cameras are waiting." And we wouldn't want to keep the audience waiting for the finale. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of black tuxedos and diamonds, smelling of expensive perfume and desperation. This was the Shark Tank. Every major investor, every board member of Sterling Capital, and half the financial press of New York City were packed into the room. They were not here for the charity. They were here to see if Preston Sterling was dead in the water. Preston guided me through the crowd with a grip that was bruising my arm. To the cameras, it looked like a protective husband shepherding his wife. To me, it felt like a jailer parading a prisoner. He was sweating. I could feel the damp heat radiating through his tuxedo jacket. He kept flashing a tight, manic smile at people who looked at him with open skepticism. "Just smile," he hissed through his teeth as we passed a cluster of reporters. "Look at me with adoration, Monique. Your job is to look like you are too happy to care about the rumors." I did smile. I smiled because I saw the board of directors sitting at table 1. I saw the chairman, a man who ruthlessly cut liabilities, watching Preston with the cold eyes of an executioner. I knew something Preston did not. I knew that my forensic report had been anonymously emailed to the chairman's private server exactly 1 hour ago. We reached the stage. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit us blindingly white. The room went quiet. Preston stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone with shaking hands. He cleared his throat, the sound booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice taking on that polished, fake sincerity he had perfected over the years. "Thank you for being here tonight. I know there has been a lot of noise in the press lately. Baseless rumors, malicious gossip designed to destabilize the great work we are doing at Sterling Capital." He paused for effect, looking out at the crowd, but there was no applause, just a heavy, skeptical silence. He swallowed hard and pivoted to his last resort: the human shield. But through it all, he continued, gesturing toward me. "I have had the unwavering support of my rock, my partner, my beautiful wife, Monique. She knows the man I really am. She knows the truth. And I would like to invite her to say a few words about the strength of our family." He stepped back, extending his hand to me. He looked at me with pleading eyes. He was begging me to save him. He expected the shy, stuttering Monique to come up, mumble a few platitudes about his integrity, and stand by his side. I stepped into the spotlight. The gold dress caught the light, shimmering like armor. A ripple of whispers went through the room. I did not look at Preston. I walked past his extended hand and stood directly in front of the microphone. I looked out at the sea of faces. I saw the investors. I saw the press. I saw the end of an era. I reached out and gripped the microphone stand. The metal was cool under my fingers. The silence in the room stretched out tight as a piano wire. Preston stood behind me, shifting his weight, waiting for me to recite the script he had drilled into my head in the car. I took a breath. It was a calm, steady breath. I looked over my shoulder at him one last time. I let him see the cold intelligence in my eyes. I let him see that the mouse was dead. I turned back to the crowd. I leaned into the microphone, my voice clear and steady, projecting to the back of the room without a tremor. My husband is right, I said. I do know the man he really is. And tonight, I think it is time that all of you know him too. I stepped back from the podium, leaving the silence to hang in the air for one heartbeat, two heartbeats. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gold gown and produced a small, sleek remote control. I had swapped it with the AV technician's clicker 5 minutes before we walked on stage. $100 bribe goes a long way with underpaid staff. I pointed the remote at the massive cinema-sized screen behind us. It was supposed to play a heartwarming montage of Sterling Capital's charitable donations. Instead, the screen flickered, the screen went black, and then a grainy high-definition video feed roared to life. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. It was a sound like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room at once. The footage was from the hidden camera I had installed in the living room. It was dated 3 days ago. On the screen, 10 feet tall, Preston Sterling stood over a cowering woman. The audience watched in horror as he raised his hand and struck her across the face. The sound of the slap, amplified by the ballroom's surround sound system, cracked like a gunshot. Preston spun around, his eyes going wide. He looked at the screen, then at the crowd. He froze, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. "Turn it off," he whispered, his face draining of blood. I clicked the remote again. The video cut. Now the screen was filled with screenshots of text messages. They were blown up so even the people in the back row could read them. The contact name was Ashley VP. The messages scrolled automatically. "I am pregnant. When are you leaving her? Just wait until the audit is over. She is too stupid to notice I am moving the money." A ripple of murmurs broke out across the room. I saw the wives of his investors covering their mouths. I saw the board members exchanging dark, furious looks. Preston was shaking now. He lunged toward the AV booth at the side of the stage, waving his arms frantically. "Cut the feed," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "It is a lie. It is a deep fake. Turn it off." I clicked the remote one last time. This was the finale. The romantic drama vanished, replaced by a cold, hard spreadsheet. It was the ledger from the Cayman Islands. The red lines tracked the wire transfers from the investor funds directly into Preston's personal shell accounts. It was irrefutable proof of embezzlement. It was a felony projected in 4K resolution. The room went deadly silent. This was not just scandal. This was theft. The investors in the room were not looking at a bad husband anymore. They were looking at a man who had stolen their money. Preston stood in front of the screen, his shadow cast against the evidence of his crimes. He looked small. He looked trapped. He turned to me, his eyes wild with betrayal. "What have you done?" he rasped. I walked back to the microphone, my heels clicking rhythmically on the stage. I looked at the crowd, then at him. "I just balanced the books, darling," I said, my voice echoing through the stunned ballroom. "And it looks like you are in the red." The ballroom was vibrating with the energy of a public execution. The investors were shouting. The reporters were flashing their cameras, and the screen behind us was still glowing with the red ink of Preston's financial ruin. Preston stood center stage, a man stripped of his armor, staring at me with a look of absolute shattering confusion. He could not reconcile the woman in the gold dress with the wife he had beaten down for 10 years. He was trying to find the seam in the reality, trying to understand how his submissive, fearful Monique had suddenly become a forensic genius and a martial artist. "You are not her," he whispered, the microphone picking up the tremble in his voice. "You look like her. You sound like her. But you are not her. Who are you?" I smiled, and this time there was no mockery in it, just a cold, final truth. You are right, Preston, I said, my voice ringing out clearly. I am not the woman you married. I am the woman you should have feared. I turned my head slightly and gestured toward the heavy velvet curtains stage left. But do not worry, I didn't come alone. The room went silent again, anticipating another twist. The curtains parted slowly. A figure stepped out from the shadows. She was wearing the blue silk dress, the dress Preston had demanded she wear. She walked slowly, her movements graceful but hesitant, lacking the predatory stalk I had perfected. Her hair was styled softly, framing a face that was the mirror image of my own. It was Monique. The real Monique. She walked onto the stage and stood next to me. We stood shoulder to shoulder, identical in feature, but worlds apart in spirit. I was the sword gleaming in gold. She was the shield resilient in blue. The visual impact was nuclear. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd that was so loud it sounded like a wave crashing. Preston's knees actually buckled. He stumbled back, gripping the podium to keep from collapsing. He looked at me. He looked at her. He looked back at me. His eyes darted frantically between our faces, trying to process the impossibility standing before him. The pieces of the last month slammed into place. The sudden change in personality, the refusal to sleep in the same bed, the memory loss, the terrifying combat skills. Twins, he choked out the word, barely escaping his throat. There are two of you. Monique took a step forward. She looked down at the man who had controlled her every breath for a decade. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked at him with a profound, pitying sadness. Hello, Preston, she said softly. Her voice was the one he remembered, gentle and melodic, but there was a new steel underneath it. Meet Dominique, my sister, my protector. Preston looked at me, his eyes wide with horror. You, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. You are the one who broke my arm. You are the one who hacked my computer. I have been living with a stranger. I stepped closer to him, towering over him in my heels. You haven't been living with a stranger, Preston. You have been living with a consequence. You thought you could break my sister in the dark, and no one would ever know. You forgot that she was born with a shadow, and shadows bite back. Preston looked around the room, searching for help, for an ally, for anyone to tell him this was a nightmare. But all he saw were hundreds of faces staring at him with judgment and disgust. He looked back at the two of us, the Sterling sisters, standing united against him. The weight of his crimes, the humiliation, and the sheer psychological shock were too much. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply broke. His legs gave out completely, and he collapsed onto the hardwood stage, sobbing into his hands at the feet of the wife he lost, and the enemy he never saw coming. The sobbing on the stage did not last long. The emotional violence of the moment was interrupted by the very real, very physical force of the United States Department of Justice. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom, usually reserved for waiters carrying trays of champagne, exploded outward. A team of 12 agents swarmed into the room. They were not wearing tuxedos. They were wearing navy blue windbreakers with bright yellow letters emblazoned on the back. FBI. The contrast was jarring. The dark, tactical reality of federal law enforcement slashed through the glittering fantasy of the gala like a knife through silk. The crowd parted instantly. Billionaires and socialites scrambled out of the way, knocking over chairs and spilling drinks in their haste to distance themselves from the target. No one wanted to be in the frame when the handcuffs came out. Preston looked up from the floor, his eyes red and swollen. He saw the agents marching down the center aisle, their faces grim and determined. He tried to scramble backward, pushing himself across the polished wood of the stage like a crab, but there was nowhere to go. Special Agent Miller, a man I had been emailing encrypted files to for the last 48 hours, vaulted onto the stage. He did not offer a hand to help Preston up. He grabbed him by the collar of his bespoke tuxedo and hauled him to his feet. Preston Sterling. The agent boomed his voice, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. You are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. Preston struggled weakly as two other agents grabbed his arms. You cannot do this here, he stammered, looking around wildly. Do you know who I am? I am Preston Sterling. This is a charity event. Turn around, the agent commanded, spinning him roughly. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was sharp and metallic. It was the definitive end of the argument. Preston Sterling, the man who thought he owned the world, was now the property of the state. From the front row, a piercing scream cut through the noise. It was Victoria. She was standing by her table, clutching her chest, her face a mask of absolute horror. She watched as her son, the golden boy, the extension of her own ego, was manhandled like a common criminal. The shame was a physical blow. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Her knees gave way. She collapsed in a heap of Chanel silk and expensive jewelry, hitting the floor with a heavy final thud. Medical and agent shouted, but the crowd just stared. The matriarch had fallen, and no one moved to help her. The spell of the Sterling power was broken. I stood center stage watching the chaos unfold with a calm, detached satisfaction. Monique stood next to me, her hand gripping my arm. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was watching the monsters who had tormented her be swept away by the tide of consequences I had engineered. Agent Miller looked at me. He gave a curt nod, acknowledging the receipt of the package. I nodded back. I leaned close to Preston as they began to drag him away. Do not worry about the bail money, Preston, I whispered. I froze those accounts too. You might want to get comfortable. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and awe. Then he was gone, dragged down the stairs and out of the ballroom, leaving behind a ruined reputation and two sisters who were finally completely free. Here is the script for the final segment. Segment 34, written in English, optimized for AI voice reading, with a triumphant, peaceful, and satisfying tone. It follows your specific instructions, continuous flow, no special characters, and strictly adhering to the plot points of segment 34. The sun over Cabo San Lucas was not like the sun in New York. It was warmer, brighter, and it did not cast long, dark shadows. It felt like forgiveness. I lay back on the teak lounge chair, looking out over the infinity pool, where the turquoise water seemed to spill directly into the Pacific Ocean. The only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs below and the distant cry of a seagull. It was the sound of absolute, unadulterated freedom. I heard the sliding glass door open behind me. Monique stepped out onto the terrace. She was wearing a white linen sundress that caught the breeze, and her hair was loose, blowing around her face. She looked nothing like the woman I had found cowering in the bathroom 3 months ago. The hollows under her eyes were filled in. The tremors in her hands were gone. She held 2 crystal flutes of chilled champagne, her grip steady and sure. She handed me a glass and sat down on the edge of my lounge chair, looking out at the horizon. It is done, she said softly. Her voice was calm, final. The lawyer just called. The sentencing hearing is over. I took the glass condensation cool against my fingers. How many years, I asked, though I already knew the answer. The federal guidelines were strict. 15 years, she said, taking a sip. Minimum security is not an option given the scale of the fraud. He is going to a medium security federal facility in upstate New York. No parole eligibility for at least 12. I nodded, watching a sailboat drift across the bay. 15 years. By the time Preston Sterling walks free, the world will have forgotten his name. He will be an old broke man with nothing but memories of the empire he threw away. And Victoria? I asked. Monique smiled, a small, satisfied curve of her lips. She is in a retirement home in Connecticut. The seizure of the assets included her personal accounts since she was listed as a beneficiary of the shell companies. She lost the estate. She lost the servants. I hear the food there is terrible. I laughed, a rich, genuine sound that felt good in my chest. We had stripped them clean. The post-nuptial agreement had held up in court like a steel wall. The judge had ruled that the infidelity and the video evidence of abuse triggered the penalty clauses immediately. Monique didn't just get a settlement, she got the kingdom. The villa we were sitting in, the yacht in the harbor, the offshore accounts that I had legally repatriated, it all belonged to her now. Monique turned to look at me. Her eyes were bright with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Dom," she whispered. "You gave me my life back. You were the shield when I couldn't fight. You were the voice when I couldn't speak." I reached out and clinked my glass against hers. The crystal rang out with a clear, pure note. "You didn't need a shield, Monique," I said. "You just needed to remember who you were. You are a Sterling now in name only. You are a Vance. And Vance women do not break." She nodded, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. She looked back out at the ocean, the owner of her own destiny for the first time in a decade. "To freedom," she said, raising her glass to the sky. I smiled, taking a long sip of the expensive champagne that Preston had paid for. "To us," I replied. We sat there as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. The nightmare was over. The monsters were in cages, and the sisters were finally beautifully free. The saga of the Sterling sisters is more than just a revenge thriller. It is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the inevitable collapse of arrogance. Preston Sterling represents the classic tyrant who mistakes silence for surrender. His downfall teaches us a crucial lesson: never underestimate the person you are trying to control. He believed his wealth and status acted as a shield against consequences, but he failed to realize that the most dangerous enemy is the one you overlook. True empowerment comes not just from physical strength, but from knowledge and strategy. Dominique didn't just use force. She used financial literacy, legal foresight, and psychological fortitude to dismantle an abuser. The story reminds us that abuse, whether emotional, physical, or financial, thrives in the dark. However, when exposed to the light of truth and the precision of a well-executed plan, even the most powerful empires can crumble. Ultimately, your greatest asset is not your bank account, but your self-worth and the courage to demand the respect you deserve. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. What would you have done in Monique's position? Let us know in the comments below.